Speak No Evil has just landed in the cinema, and some of you may or may not know that this 2024 release is actually a remake of a Danish psychological horror movie that was released 2 years ago. I always find it interesting that it's considered a foreign language film because I'd probably say that about 70% of the film is actually in English, but I suppose even 30% of a language that isn't English could be enough to put some people off watching it if they're not used to it. Nevertheless, Hollywood got their hands on this story and have remade it starring James McAvoy as one half of a murderous couple. With it only being 2 years since the original and this one having a more mainstream distribution, I was keen to see how similar they'd be. And I wasn't surprised with the fact that they changed quite a few things in this remake. So I thought I'd compare both movies, their similarities, their differences, and come to the conclusion on which one I think is better. So let's get into it. Here is a comparison of the Speak No Evil movies. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers on both of them. The ending. The biggest area where these two movies probably differ is with regards to the ending. The key message of the films are the exact same. It focuses on the theme of being too polite for your own good, holding back on what you want to say, and the inability to remove yourself from a situation that you're uncomfortable in. This is because of the fear of upsetting somebody that you barely know. Within the original movie, the ending really leans into that theme, and it shows that there are severe consequences to your actions if you do the complete opposite to what your gut says. Bjorn and Louise were uncomfortable in the house with Patrick and Karen, but they were too kind for their own good, and they fell victim to being exploited by the people in front of them. It turned out that Patrick and Karen was this serial killer couple that would befriend a family on holiday, invite them to their house, kill them, and then keep the child, ultimately chopping their tongue out so they wouldn't be able to reveal that they weren't actually theirs. What was powerful about this ending was that Bjorn had multiple opportunities all throughout the movie, and even during the ending, to either remove his family from the situation, or even kill Patrick when he left the keys in the car. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, ultimately meaning that his daughter was taken and his wife's life were taken. Taken in the most brutal of ways, being stoned to death. Plus, in this movie, we also saw that Abel, the boy that Patrick and Karen kidnapped, was also killed too. This ending was dark, and it really showed that there were consequences to being too kind. It's a deeply unsettling ending, especially when you take into consideration that you actually see the rocks hitting the couple. Plus, with Patrick, Karen, and Agnes going to a holiday destination in the final moments, it showed that the cycle was going to continue, and another family was going to be destroyed. When looking at the 2024 movie, the ending couldn't have been more different to that. We obviously found out that Patrick and Kira were this serial killer couple that were killing other couples to take their children, but instead of the kind individuals dying as a consequence to not removing themselves from the situation when they were uncomfortable, they actually managed to overpower the murderers and escaped with their lives, whilst both Patrick and Kira were killed. Whilst the outcome of the ending was different, it was one that was still enjoyable and had tense moments throughout it, but I feel the message of the movie lost some potency because they didn't end up dead. Ben and Louise were a couple that couldn't even decline meat when offered it, despite the fact that Louise was a vegetarian. So I found the fight back difficult to believe, especially when they'd been so willing to just go along with everything the entire time. It went against the character's traits slightly, and I also think the hard-hitting consequence wasn't really there. And ultimately, that's what I think the entire point of the movie is. If you don't listen to your gut and you never speak your mind, you'll eventually be taken advantage of. This couple did get taken advantage of, but they walked away unharmed, or, well, with a broken ankle. There was no shock factor other than what Ant did to Patrick at the end, which felt like a homage to the original ending where he bludgeoned him to death with a rock. So I kinda like that callback. The similarity in the shots. The thing that I thought was probably the most similar in both of the movies were the type of shots that they had running throughout the films and the way that it looked. For example, in the opening section of both movies, where the main character was looking for the stuffed bunny around the city, there were these shots like there was somebody almost looking around a corner, hunting them, and waiting to pounce. Which is obviously what goes on to happen when Patrick introduces himself. So the visual representation of the hunt that was present in both movies was something that I liked. There were also a lot of shots of the landscape. The landscape and environment is almost like a weapon in both of the films. This is because they're both set in remote areas, and the fact that there's nobody near or around them shows how vulnerable both of the kind couples are. So by leaning into that from a visual perspective, it showed you just how bad of a situation they were all in. There were also similarities in other shots, such as the two men bonding together in a close environment, the dancing scene, which was a real turning point, and also the scene where they both screamed, although I feel that one was executed better in the original. One scene that was cut and one that was slightly different in the remake, which I think took away from the creepiness of Patrick, was the shower scene where Patrick entered the bathroom whilst Louise was having a shower and just pretty much asserted his dominance in his house and showed that he could do what he liked with nobody saying anything. And also the scene of Patrick watching Bjorn and Louise being intimate with one another. This moment was key to Agnes getting into bed with Patrick and Karen, which led Louise to want to leave for the first time, whereas in the remake, Patrick just watched through the door as Ben and Louise were arguing with one another. Then, when Louise ultimately went on to find Agnes in bed with Kira and Patrick, there was no real logical explanation because they weren't preoccupied and we didn't hear Agnes calling for her. So whilst there were a lot of similar scenes, there were some important ones that were left out, which I think impacted the storytelling just a bit. The foreshadowing. One big difference that I found in the two films is that within the Danish original, there were a lot of subtle hints about what was on the horizon and the fate of the two characters, something that wasn't really that present in the remake. For example, once you know the ending, when you rewatch the original, there are lines of dialogue that paint a bleak ending for the kind couple. For example, within the first third of the movie, there are lines of dialogue such as, "What's the worst that can happen?" which was spoken when Bjorn and Louise were deciding whether or not to go. Bjorn said to Louise on another occasion, "There's only a day and a half left, I'm sure you'll survive." And Louise also said to Agnes, "You're with your mum and dad now, nothing's going to happen to you." Upon that rewatch and in knowing the ending, it becomes dramatic irony, and it makes those throwaway lines have so much more impact because you know that they don't make it out of the weekend. Knowing that the original had many different lines of dialogue incorporated in the first third, I was eagerly listening out for them to see if there was anything that was going to be pointing me in the direction of the ending, but sadly there wasn't. It's not a massive deal, but I think it can often show intelligence in the writing, and it almost makes a fool out of us, the viewer, when it's included, because it makes you wonder how we didn't see it from a mile off. The iconic scene. There are a couple of iconic scenes in the original movie, whether that be the dancing scene, which was present in the remake, the stoning scene, which obviously didn't feature in the remake. But one that did carry over was the one where both of the men were standing in open space and screamed with all of their might. Within the original, this is such a haunting scene because it's ultimately the destination of where Patrick and Karen kill both Bjorn and Louisa, and it also emphasizes how nobody can hear a scream there. Something that we heard and experienced when the camera cut further back and we just heard the faintest noise in the distance. Within the remake, they included this scene, but it just kind of felt like they included it because it was iconic. It held no relevance to the death, and it was framed more as a way of Ben letting out the energy and hatred for his life that he had within him. Something that if I hadn't seen the original, then I would have probably thought was fine. But knowing how important this singular scene is in the original, I was almost expecting Patrick and Ben to end up back there at the end, so I was a bit disappointed in that. The characters. In terms of the characters in the movies, they are literally the exact same. You have Bjorn and Ben, the husband that is a weak individual that can't make his own decisions, can't stand up to the person that's making himself and his family feel uncomfortable, and is just overly polite for polite's sake. They even took this a step further in the remake by making him not say anything when Patrick was being inappropriate with Louise, just making him look on in silence. You also have Louise, who is the wife that had the same name in both movies. She's like her husband in being overly polite. However, from time to time, she does actually stand up for what she believes in. More so towards the end of the movie when she realizes that things are a bit off, but by then it's too late. You have Karen and Kira, who's the wife to Patrick and one half of the serial killer couple. Both of these characters are performed in a very similar nature and have a sinister edge to them. And then there's also Patrick. Patrick is the person that Bjorn and Ben pretty much want to be, and is what one would describe as your stereotypical masculine guy, especially when compared to the others. Both depictions are good in their own right and are very similar. The character that the actors play at the start of the movie is drastically different to the one that they're playing at the end, and it takes good skill to make that convincing. Plus, you've got Abel and Ant, and also Agnes. So, which one's better? Well, I like my horror movies to be as dark, creepy, and thought-provoking as they can possibly be, and when I first watched the ending to the original movie, I was left shocked at what I just watched in front of me. I didn't see that ending coming from a mile off, and it stayed with me for well over a year and a half until I saw this movie was coming out. I think the first movie perfectly encapsulates the consequences of being overly polite and not removing yourself from a situation where your family could be harmed at the risk of upsetting somebody else. And personally, I didn't really get that as much from the remake. I also felt like with the original not having this large hunting scene around the house, whilst it wasn't as exciting, it focused more on the fear with Patrick following the car and lurking in the shadows. Plus, I'd also say seeing the operation at play, the tongue being cut off and the cyclical nature of it happening again, it just left you feeling sick. The remake is a very good film in its own right, and it doesn't ruin what's a good original, but I just think it lacks the potency at the expense of making the final third an exciting, thrilling fight to survive, when the point of the movie is that they wouldn't fight to survive because they simply just let the killers do it. I'd recommend both of them because you get two completely different experiences, but if you can only watch one, then please watch the original. So, there you have it, a comparison of the Speak No Evil movies. If you want to see a full breakdown on both of the movies, then click on the card in the top corner, they'll both be up there. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find more of your favourite TV shows and movies broken down. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rated both of these movies out of 5 stars, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate all of the latest releases in real time. Which movie do you prefer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.